Today I'm joined by Dr. Manoj Doss. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at at Johns Hopkins University, where he studies psychedelics and how they impact the brain. Super cool. Manoj, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Hey, what's up, man?
Nice to have you here. So yeah, I'd like to hear from you just a brief overview of your work, and then we can talk about your background and some more specifics.
Cool. Yeah. So I studied the acute and the enduring effects of psychedelic drugs as well as other drugs on brain function and cognition. So I was trained really in cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, but more cognitive psychology than anything. And I wanted some of my work, I guess, to have some applicability. So I started studying kind of clinical applications and whatnot to memory research and drugs. And that's how I got into where I'm at.
Yeah, cool. So you started off at a more traditional cognitive psychology end, and then only later became interested in neuroscience or psychopharmacology?
I kind of went back and forth. So it was interesting. I guess maybe if I were to go back to the beginning, I actually in undergrad I started off as an electrical engineer, and then one semester in I quit after having a concussion. I think what I didn't like was programming, and now I do more programming than I ever did that first semester.
Yeah.
But that concussion was kind of an interesting experience, and it got me interested in psychology. Although I think I was more thinking along the lines of like clinical psychology. And then I went abroad for a year, and in the process took a cognitive neuroscience class at University College London. And that got me interested in cognitive neuroscience. And then I worked in Ali Preston's lab, who's an fMRI episodic memory person at UT Austin for a year, my last year. And then I thought that was really cool. I also thought it was super difficult. Like everybody in there was a physicist, mathematician, statistician, as well as a psychologist and neuroscientist. And I kind of wanted some of this work. It was difficult for me to imagine how some of that work could really have clinical applications, at least in my lifetime, or many even like courtroom applications, etc. So then I did a master's at University College London, where I was working with Val Curran and Celia Morgan and Sanjeev Kamboj. And so we were working on this project in which we looked at the effects of cannabidiol on emotional processing, and that sort of showed me how some of these cognitive paradigms could be useful for example, seeing how a drug affects kind of basic emotional processes. And turns out CBD did absolutely nothing. And then after kind of getting an idea of where cognitive psychology could go in terms of application, I then went back to a cognitive neuroscience lab working with Charan Ranganath at UC Davis. And over there, I was actually working a lot on a behavioral project that never really, we replicated the effect twice and then didn't replicate it 4 more times. So pretty sure it was just chance. And so, but then there was some imaging stuff that I was working on. But then I wanted to do in my PhD work with, kind of psychopharmacology and kind of bring my 2 interests together. And so I worked with Dave Gallo at the University of Chicago. And he's more of a cognitive psychologist than, he's got some fMRI studies out, but he himself will say he's a cognitive psychologist. So I got a really good training in cognitive psychology and just like, how much it takes to, without even needing fancy brain pictures or statistics, like what it takes to really do interesting cognitive psych work. And then I started collaborating. I continued this collaboration he had with Harriet DeWitt, in which I looked at the effects of a few different drugs, MDMA, THC, and alcohol on episodic memory, emotional episodic memory, how memory can be distorted, etc. And then starting my postdoc, I went back to brain imaging, as well as some basic behavioral paradigms again. So I've kind of jumped around a bit, but I think brains are cool. I think fancy statistics are cool, but I still really appreciate most like interesting behaviors and seeing how you can move those around, and how, for example, some drugs might move some processes in one direction and then move the other process in the other direction, whereas another drug might do the complete opposite. I think that's probably one of the coolest things to show.
Yeah, and with drug studies, I imagine that it's less focused on maybe like the study design and whatever technology you're using, and more just literally on the drug. It's like comparing, I don't know, placebo and whatever drug you're looking at, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, that's true. I mean, it's yeah, it's kind of interesting. I feel really weird sometimes about the psychopharm world where it is about studying the drug, and yet, especially maybe I should say this is particularly true of the psychedelics world, where people think they're actually studying, psychology, or what they'll say is consciousness, for example. And really what they're studying is the effects of the drug. They're not learning anything about the mind from these drugs. And so that's
Hmm.
been, I feel like, something that I've been, going with, and I need to write more about this. But it's been a massive criticism I find, and especially in the field with psychedelics, where I've learned absolutely nothing about the mind from psychedelics.
Hmm.
I've learned about the mind from basic cognitive psychology paradigms, though.
Right. So the two big interests you mentioned wanting to bring together, it was that more abstract idea of understanding the mind, and then the clinical applications of what drugs can do in terms of health and behavior and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, exactly. So one is just, I mean, I do have a kind of basic curiosity about just how the mind works, and kind of selfish reasons for one to study it, in which I don't think I'm going to benefit society at all, at least in my lifetime. um, but yeah, there's always been this side of me that when I got interested in psychology, or even back in high school when I took a psychology class, was how can some of this information be used to help people, whether that be in a clinical setting, or in court cases, for example, eyewitness testimonies. So that was kind of, yeah, I've wanted to bring those kind of ideas together. And I think one of the cool things about episodic memory research was that there was this idea of reconsolidation. So this idea in which when you retrieve a memory, it undergoes a state that's labile, and then you can manipulate it in some ways. You can strengthen it, delete it, or distort it. And so they were, at least it was shown with animal models, that with certain drugs you can kind of facilitate the deletion, let's say, of a memory, or changing of it. And I don't think that's quite worked very well in humans with drugs or without drugs. But I'm kind of hoping that maybe psychedelics might be one way in which we can destabilize memories more, to be able to change them in an adaptive way.
Uh-huh. So would adaptive mean something like if you have PTSD and a bad memory, the drugs would hopefully help you get rid of those thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it can mean a few things, right? One is that in PTSD, they actually have kind of distorted memories. I'm trying to think of the paper. It's, I think, Martin Conway from 2005 or six. He talks about, he actually reports this case study of a person who had PTSD after 9/11. They weren't, I don't think they were directly in they weren't at ground zero, but I think they could see people scrambling around them, and obviously some kind of panic happening. Maybe there was even ashes, who knows? But they reported feeling like they floated above the city, and were just completely emotionless to the whole thing. And I can't remember if this is, so that paper has to do with the idea of the self and autobiographical memory. And I can't remember if that maybe made them feel bad that they didn't feel any emotion to that whole experience. But I mean, the whole experience was distorted. They obviously didn't float above
Hmm.
the city, and chances are they were probably also in a panic themselves.
Uh-huh.
And so that was kind of, yeah, distorting things back in a direction that's, let's say, less distorted, or less, closer to reality. But yeah, there's also probably other situations in which just getting rid of memories wouldn't be a bad idea. It's good to know that you fought for your country in the war. It's probably not super useful to remember vividly that you watched a child being beheaded, right?
Hmm.
And so I think there's other situations though too, where you can make memories more adaptive, like with somebody with let's say depression. This is actually a problem in PTSD as well. They have overgeneralized memories. And so you could think that, for example, if every day is kind of the same, you go to the grocery store and it's the same thing every time. But today there was a sale on avocados. Now you can have like mad avocado toast, right? And a person with depression probably wouldn't even recognize that as being, hey, that's like something that's something to look forward to. That was an
Hmm.
idiosyncratic piece to my day that I should be happy about. So I think if you can re-encode memories in that sort of fashion, I think that can kind of boost you to, I don't know, to be more adaptive in your everyday life.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. So this is probably a super loaded question, but so normal antidepressants, from what I know, it's either they give you more of the happy chemicals or they block the reuptake of the happy chemicals, so they kind of just stay there floating around longer. But this sounds way more complicated than that. So do we know what it's doing, if it's related to memory and actually changing the way we think about things?
I mean, I don't think that necessarily all this is related to memory. I think it's just probably one aspect of it,
Uh-huh.
or it's one idea that I kind of hope that is related to memory, given that I studied memory for so long and I
Uh-huh.
studied drugs for so long. but yeah, so yeah, so if you're talking about psychedelics, and so when I say psychedelic, I mean the serotonin 2A agonists. So I mean LSD, psilocybin, DMT, 2CB, mescaline, etc. Um, and so, I mean, those do actually work on the serotonergic system, which is presumably what you meant by the happy chemicals. Maybe you meant
Yeah.
that one and dopamine.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I mean, those drugs literally bind to a serotonin receptor. They bind to a few serotonin receptors, depending on which drug you're talking about. But even the phenethylamine drugs, that would be mescaline, which has, I think it binds to the least amount of serotonin receptors, maybe the 1 family and the 2 family, but not like the 4 family, perhaps. Um, yeah, even those you can probably attribute the serotonin 2A receptor to most of its effects. And so drugs like, fluoxetine, that's Prozac, or citalopram, or any of these other SSRIs, I mean, they increase synaptic serotonin by, yeah, blocking the transporter.
Mhm.
And so what's interesting, I think, about the serotonin 2A receptor is that it doesn't have super high affinity for serotonin itself. It might be the lowest affinity out of the 14 serotonin receptors, or one of the lowest. And so what you can, what that kind of tells you is that, oh, hey, by now increasing synaptic serotonin, we might get a higher likelihood that you're going to get serotonin to bind to the 2A receptor, whereas psychedelic drugs just kind of bypass that whole, increasing synaptic serotonin, increasing normal, what could normally happen in the brain, which I guess SSRIs aren't normally what can happen in the brain, but there's situations in which you can get a bunch of synaptic serotonin, and then you might get some binding to the 2A receptor. And instead, yeah, psychedelics just kind of bypass that whole thing
Mhm.
just by binding mostly to that receptor, as well as, the 2C receptor, the 1A receptor, et
Uh-huh.
cetera.
So they're the same receptors, but then one drug might just improve your mood or do something like relatively simple, and another can give you like crazy hallucinations and all this other stuff. So how does that happen?
Right. Well, I mean, so I was getting at this a little bit. So you can actually get kind of crazy hallucinations without the drug, as long as you bind to the 2A receptor. I mean, maybe if you bind to the 2A receptor, I don't want to say that that's the necessary piece there. But serotonin syndrome is situations in which you can get too much serotonin. Like, for example, if you take an SSRI and 5-HTP, that's a serotonin precursor that you can get at, like, GNC or whatever. Um, if you were to take those two together, you could get serotonin syndrome, and people will report having hallucinations and whatnot, although it's not typically pleasant. I mean, I think there's a lot, when you get a bunch of serotonin in the system, there's a lot of serotonin in your gut. You get stomach problems. There's, you can get like hypertension, I think. So there's a lot of, I mean, like, that's a potentially deadly syndrome. Like, I don't recommend anybody try that. But so there are situations that might be related to the, 2A agonism. So, I mean, I guess one way to test that is give somebody serotonin syndrome and then give them a serotonin 2A antagonist and see whether or not they will still hallucinate. They'll probably still report it being extremely uncomfortable and, almost die. This is why you couldn't do this study. But, it'd be interesting to see if they didn't hallucinate in that sort of situation.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that the psychedelic drugs, I mean, they're almost certainly doing something else as well. There's, these intracellular cascades that they're probably driving something in a fashion that's not being driven in the same way as serotonin itself, which is probably also why a bunch of these drugs have, differences in terms of their subjective effects as well. Although, that could in part be due to the different effects on other receptors and transporters and whatnot.
Yeah. So in terms of getting funding for this type of research, well, it seems like in research it's all about the funding, and that things that have like direct medical or practical benefits tend to be more well funded than things that are just theoretically interesting. So is would you say that the primary goal of studying psychedelics is like for the medical applications, or is that like sort of just a loop around in order to get funding, and people tend to be more interested in it for other reasons?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the research center.
Mhm.
I would say that what we're doing does have mostly kind of clinical applications, but I mean, that's not even strictly what we're doing, right? Like
Mhm.
we put out that salvia study, which a lot of people later asked me, do you think that, salvia or salvinorin A is going to have some clinical benefit? Is that what your next step is? And it was like, I mean, I don't know, it might have some clinical benefit, but no, I mean, really that study was just kind of pure curiosity. What does this do in terms of brain function acutely? Um,
What did it
but
do?
it did very similar things, at least based on the measures we used, as classic psychedelic drugs. So salvinorin A does not bind to the same receptor. It binds to an opioid receptor, the kappa opioid receptor specifically, which is not the same one that heroin and codeine and all these other drugs go after. But I think there's other places, like I know that UT Austin was trying to get some research going. And when I spoke to some people there, even though it is happening in their new department, their new medical, or what they're hoping to get started is happening in their new their school of medicine, which is relatively recent. I think they were wanting to differentiate themselves by looking at more kind of basic research. If you look at, I think NYU, it sounds like almost like everything that they're doing. I feel like it was NYU or Harvard. I can't remember. One of those two, I felt like it was like very, very on the clinical end. Actually, it might have been at NYU, and I think Harvard's seems to be very heavy on maybe the brain imaging end, if I'm not mistaken. And so, and if you looked at Imperial College London, they were kind of, in between. And I think so are we to some degree. And so, yeah, I mean, the clinical stuff is what gets funded. And I mean, I think in some ways, I feel like, a lot of researchers should be going down that avenue, not just with drugs, but with, whatever else, with basic aspects of cognition. We should be studying those things in clinical populations at least once in a while, because yeah, it's the public's money half the time, and we want it to, go far. We want it to help society. But yeah, what's interesting here is that all of our funding is, at this point, is that true? Most of it is private. I'm not even on, I was on a publicly funded postdoctoral fellowship, and now I'm not. I'm on the center grant, which is private funded. So yeah, I mean, I think even the donors, like some of them do probably have kind of, ideas about how they think the brain works and how drugs might or might not be able to tell us something about it. But I think a lot of times maybe they don't have the knowledge to be able to know that that's going to be worth executing. And so a lot of times they will, I think that, yeah, for most people, I think they just, they want to fund a particular study. I think after the center got funded, someone, I think they had someone, close to them that has OCD, and they were like, hey, you want to fund an OCD study? And it was like, yeah, sure. And so I think an OCD study will be started up at the center sooner or later.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, I think the funding game is definitely interesting. I myself have been talking to a lot of people for trying to get funding, trying to figure out a faculty position type situation, because you can't really apply for just standard faculty positions the way you would in a normal academic department. Everything is it has to be in a med school, and typically med schools don't have those positions. And when they do have those positions, they're usually not trying to do a bunch of crazy drug research. So
Uh-huh.
so
Yeah,
yeah, chasing money is a huge a huge thing.
part of why I asked that is wondering how so there are some studies where you might think it directly relates to something clinical, like maybe depression, and then there's others where I remember one from your advisor, Roland Griffiths. I don't know if you were involved in it, but it was looking at psilocybin and how it impacts personality. And that seems like this way more abstract thing, because it doesn't seem like personality changes are beneficial. I don't know if they're harmful, but that's just this way more kind of subjective, abstract thing to study.
Yeah. So I mean, I think with something like, what did that study find? I wasn't part of it. Openness, I think, maybe increased.
Yeah.
Sometimes in general, like personality psychology, there was this whole replication crisis, and it was like personality psychology and social psychology got hit the hardest by the replication crisis. Don't get me wrong, there was
Mhm.
definitely various cognitive paradigms that didn't replicate, and there's various cognitive paradigms that I'm extremely skeptical of. Um, I can say that at least all of my behavioral effects have replicated by
Mhm.
me, but by others, who knows? And yeah, I'm always skeptical sometimes of just personality psychology in general. I hate to say that, especially because I have some friends in that field. But yeah, I mean, I think something like openness, it does, I think, tend to be associated with, let's say, improvements in, I don't know, I don't have a specific citation, but here's what I think I've read is that people who are more open are also maybe more likely to recover from some certain mental illness. I could be wrong on that one, but
Pretty cool if
so
true.
even I think that's probably true, but I don't know. I mean, I think that there is. I'm sure if Roland were here, he'd be able to give you a better reason why that does relate to something clinical. Um, but yeah, I mean, some of our studies, it's like anything in science. You can't ever predict what's going to be the next, medical breakthrough. I
Mhm.
don't think, Crick and that racist guy knew that what was, that the double helix, how much of an influence it was going to have on the rest of, medicine. They were just getting the structure of, DNA. And so I think similarly, we don't know what's going to be the next medical breakthrough. And so we just have to study things kind of just from like a critical lens and figure out, hey, what's, interesting here? And can this then later on be applied in some fashion that, or
Uh-huh.
maybe someone else will find out how it can be applied in some fashion that is useful for the rest of society.
Yeah. So you talked about replication in psychology, and then in psychopharmacology, I feel like, on one hand, it's like these are fixed chemical substances that must be measured very carefully. And so on that end, you would think that the effects would replicate a lot more easily. But on the other hand, I'm guessing that certain drugs influence certain people differently. So do you like what do you find that most of the effects you see are like they generalize across people, or are there certain groups of people that like have very different effects than others?
Right. So our ends are tiny. Our sample size is really small. And so I have no idea half the time, how generalizable these effects are. Um, but at least now I try to show single subject data so that you can at least see some of that variability. I think that anybody who hides single subject data, unless you have like 200 subjects and it just looks absurd if you show single subject data, it just looks like a blob. Um, yeah, I think that if you don't show single subject data, I think you have something to hide at this point. And so I try to do that. So for example, in the Salvia study, we showed that every subject showed a decrease in a particular metric, in this case, the functional connectivity of the default mode network. So then you're able to see, okay, well, everybody showed that effect. But I think in general, across like all of our studies, even with all of my, I was just talking about how I've replicated all of my behavioral effects. These are just purely behavioral effects, no drugs involved. Um, some people show the effect massively and some people don't. And even there you get variability. So I mean, I don't think it's that different from in psychopharmacology, except that it's a lot harder to replicate these things. I mean, it's it takes a lot more time to even get approval for these studies, and then to run them, to even find subjects is extremely difficult. So it's I think it's like, give us a break a little bit. At the same time, I do think at this point, people running studies below 20 subjects is a little absurd. And Doug, and I'm still part
Mhm.
of studies that are going to be below 20 subjects. And that's, in part due to funding, in part due to not being able to convince my higher ups, et cetera, And so, I think that, in general, when we look for effects, this is across all of psychology, we try to see just like, what's the average effect? And so I don't think this is any different for drugs. It's like, what does this do on average? And chances are, some of these effects that we find, they do hold up probably in all individuals. It's just that in that particular situation, there was some noise going on. There was something that changed that day. That person also drank too much coffee or something, and that's why they're not showing the effect. So I don't know. I think I'm still on this idea of just finding just general effects that tend to hold up, um, versus like catering to individuals. But there are certain things that, at least clinically, that are worth looking at catering to individuals. Like, do people on antidepressants show, and by antidepressants here I mean like SSRIs, do they
Mhm.
show improvements in their mood from psychedelics? So it's kind of a pretty well known now that if you take SSRIs, there's downregulation of the serotonin 2A receptor, and that it usually takes a lot more drug, in this case psychedelics, to get an effect. And this isn't true of everybody, though. This is, again, an average thing I'm telling you. Like, I don't,
Yeah.
I hope that nobody listens to this and thinks, oh, hey, I'm on Prozac and therefore I should take like 7 grams of mushrooms and has the worst trip of their life. But on average, that tends to be true. That people who've been on antidepressants, even in recent, even if they're off of it, if they've been on them recently, I think this has happened a handful of times in the lab, and they can't prove this, but like, hey, a lot of these people weren't showing an effect. Oh, hey, they were on Prozac, which has a really long half-life, and although it's out of their system, they still have potentially downregulation of serotonin 2A receptors. So it's like, I think finding things like that will be useful and worth doing. But yeah, sometimes I just look for these
Mhm.
like kind of average effects. What does this drug do on average?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the effects that you're looking at, does it tend to be like you're looking at they take the drug and then for a few hours they're high and you look at what happens during that time, or are you looking at long-term effects of taking the drug?
Yeah, so there's the acute effects, which I'm interested in, and then there's the enduring effects that I'm also interested in. So it depends on the study, but yeah, the study with Salvinorin A, that was looking at while they were on the drug, whereas all of the psilocybin work I've been doing involves like a week later or a month later, how long, what's still going on, what's changed. And I mean, there is actually, a study where I was just reanalyzing data, looking at the acute effects of psilocybin on episodic memory. And yeah, so I mean, I think it just depends on, the study and what we're doing. I think, yeah, looking at the acute effects will be interesting, more for personal reasons, more for just, the personal curiosity. What is this drug doing to change behavior in the brain? But looking at the enduring effects is probably more useful clinically. At the same time, sometimes you might need to see what happens acutely to be able to better predict what happens, in the long term for clinical benefit. And so, I mean, I think both of those are important.
What happens when you have a research subject who takes a drug and then they have a bad trip?
Uh, so that's only happened. So what's nice now as a postdoc is I don't have to run participants much.
Uh-huh.
I will be running some participants, and then hopefully it'll get offloaded onto a research assistant at some point. A lot of people think that's the most interesting part,
You
and
know
I
what?
think
Let's
if that's
start
what
with
you,
what happens when they have a good trip or have any trip. Like, how does the thing actually happen? And then, like, how is this the studies are run? Because it's kind of weird to imagine like a scientist in their coat. Probably none of them actually wear coats, and then like administering this illegal drug. I guess they're technically illegal outside of research. And then, yeah, what happens?
Yeah, so it depends on the lab. So when I was working with Harriet DeWitt, I mean, we were using MDMA, as well as THC. Both of those drugs can have somewhat unpredictable and bad or good effects. And so in her lab, the environment was relatively sterile. It was fluorescent lights. There was a couch that they could sit on, um, and there were some magazines, and we weren't supposed to be in the rooms, only to check on them every, 15 minutes, or if they ever needed anything, they could come get us. We were in the room next door. And to be honest, I kind of preferred that. I like having control, experimental control. I think that's, when you're looking at just kind of pure basic behavior, that's the best way to go about it. Over here at Hopkins, though, with psilocybin, yeah, people lay on a couch with eye shades on. And I mean, when you're talking about these massive doses of psilocybin that we give people, I mean, I think it's probably a good place to start to make sure that they don't have a bad trip. And you sit there in the room with them. Um, Although, we're doing an acute drug study where it's only 10 milligrams of psilocybin, which is, I don't know, it's probably a little bit less than the average street dose the first person might take, or maybe it's around the average street dose the first person might take. It's kind of hard to say because, mushrooms always have more, more or less psilocybin in an unpredictable fashion, whereas we're going to give people, something about, around 10 to 15 milligrams. And so in this so in that situation, I actually don't know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to have people probably sitting on a couch for a little bit, but they're going to have EEG on them, so they might be sitting in a chair the whole time. But the rooms are, dimly lit. There's, nice paintings in the room, etc. I think Roland likes to keep Buddha statues in there. Matt Johnson thinks it's absurd. I'm kind of more on the Matt Johnson side of things. Not really a fan of religion or the idea of mapping on, Eastern ideas onto this, onto like Western people. But yeah, I think people generally in Harriet studies, I don't know how much people, really enjoyed themselves. They didn't not enjoy themselves. But I don't know if it was something that some people would do those studies again. Whereas over here, I think for sure there's an experience that's created around it that is good for many reasons. It gives us a good reputation of, I don't think Harriet has a bad reputation by any means. I think Harriet's got a great reputation. But I think in some ways you do lose experimental control when you do that. So I don't know. Yeah, people have a good time. I think generally there's definitely people that have challenging times. And I think that there's a lot of people, especially in the clinical studies with various disorders, whenever they're given massive doses, they have definitely a very challenging time and what would not be described as a good trip. Yet they still, a lot of them do come out feeling better eventually,
Right. Yeah, I remember one study where they were looking at, I think, a group of like terminally ill patients, and they gave them psilocybin, I think, and then they described changing their outlook on life, like the drug made them feel better or something like that.
Yeah. I think that's what a lot of people say. I think I think that regardless, there was a whole thing about challenging experiences that a lot of times, regardless of if it's challenging or not, that you do feel good in the end, that you feel like you benefited from it. Just like how you might have, I don't know, it's bad to compare this to pregnancy. It's bad. It's bad to compare to pregnancy for one reason, and that's because there's this whole idea that people think that when you're going through a trip, you're re-experiencing birth, and I think that's an absolutely absurd sort of Freudian idea. But the one way that I think it is, relevant to something like pregnancy is that, well, I've known women that say that, oh yeah, that was totally worth it. I've known other women be like, what the hell was that? And at the end of the day, I think most would say that that was an overall like good experience in the sense that I'm glad that, most women would maybe say, I'm glad I went through that. Yeah, so I think similarly over here, it's like it can be very challenging. Not as physically challenging as pregnancy by any means. I don't want to, don't want my words taken out of place, but it can be very challenging for people, and yet, they do feel better at the very end. But that's not everybody. There's definitely people who, there was one person in the depression study that didn't get better. There was, I think there's some people that have even, I don't know in our studies particularly, but people have reported getting worse. And I was just, I should not out anybody here. I was just at a, oh, you know what I can say? I'd say I was at a wedding. I was at a wedding, and there's a bunch of people I once knew who, they, got into, various hard drugs and whatnot. And they've had, multiple bouts of rehab and opioid replacement therapy, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think they ever felt like psychedelics helped them, regardless of how much change it induced in their life. So, it doesn't help everybody or every condition, but, certainly something probably like existential crisis. And I imagine that's probably what it's best for. And I think a lot of times that's what can underlie things like depression, even when you're not about to die. You either think about your death all the time, which closet am I going to go to? Or, you think about what's the purpose in any of this. And so I think in those situations, I think these drugs might have their best benefit. Not to say that I don't think that, I think some people would probably benefit from it from addiction, but, at least, let's just say the high school I went to had a lot of people that ended up getting into some shit. Can I say that? Sorry. And there was, I don't think those people benefited from their psychedelic experiences.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so a lot of the research seems to be going into like what are the potential benefits of these things, and I imagine there's an equal amount of research focusing on the harms, but I'm not sure, outside of like crazy drugs like heroin or whatever, the harms of things like psychedelics aren't talked about as often. So, like, are there harms? Has your research found anything in one direction or the other?
Kind of, yeah. Well, so I mean, I guess kind of broadly speaking, before I get into my own work, I mean, yeah, I think one reason people don't talk about it is that, yeah, there was all this focus on how harmful these drugs were, from the 60s onward. And so everybody kind of knows about what those harms are, or if anything, they know better about what those harms are than what the potential benefits are. And so, I mean, I think people are kind of trying to de-emphasize that. I mean, I think another reason is that a lot of psychedelic researchers are what we call true believers. They've done the drugs themselves, and they think that, they're not quite Timothy Leary level, but, they do think that they're going to be, massively beneficial. And maybe some of them don't even totally recognize the harms. But yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that we do have to worry about is, people who have, people with potentially with predispositions to something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. I don't know about bipolar disorder necessarily, but definitely I think schizophrenia might make sense. I do know, usually people talk about LSD being the kind of culprit. I do know somebody who, after a shroom trip, never quite came back. And I think to this day, she's still on, antipsychotics, although that's not to say that, it wouldn't have come out from some other stressor in her life. But it seems pretty clear that it was after that, during the trip, there was something bad that happened and then never fully was there again. I think she's totally functional now, but she's on antipsychotics. And when she decides to get off of them, bad things start happening. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a possibility. I think, even people talk about getting things like tinnitus afterwards that can last for some period of time. That can be distracting or distressful. People talk about being just more sensitive. Sometimes we think of this kind of sensitive plastic period that occurs after psychedelic experiences, that we think that occurs after psychedelic experiences in humans. It's been shown to some degree in animals, but that, this is typically a good thing, that this is when, people might be more, plastic. They might be more, their memories might be more labile, for example, and I think for some that might not be the best thing in the world for them. They might need more stability than that. So yeah, I think that there are potential harms. I feel like, I don't know, I hope that more people think like me. Maybe they just don't, they're not as outspoken. But I do sometimes find myself being kind of like the downer in, psychedelic research, where it's like, hey, hold up, here's this thing in which they might be bad, or here's this thing in which they're definitely not good, or that here's this thing that's like just neutral and we shouldn't interpret it as a good or a bad thing. And so at least one of the effects that we found, so this paper's in review now, is that with psilocybin and with MDMA, and people always talk about MDMA is a different drug, blah blah blah. I'm just gonna put this out there, and I've said it many times. I'm gonna keep saying it. MDMA is actually two drugs. Most MDMA is actually two drugs. It's the R enantiomer and the S enantiomer. And so the S enantiomer is generally what gives us these effects that we think are more related to MDMA. That would be the stimulant effects due to its effects on norepinephrine and dopamine. And then also what it does to synaptic serotonin. And that's really what makes MDMA, differentiates MDMA from amphetamine or meth, is what it's doing to that synaptic serotonin. And so, but on top of that, you do have the R enantiomer, which is a weak agonist of the serotonin 2A receptor. And so there is some psychedelic effects. And actually, I wonder if the effects are even weaker, because now this weak agonist of the serotonin 2A receptor has to compete with all the synaptic serotonin, the serotonin that's not only being prevented from being reuptaken, it's also being released. So MDMA actually reverses that transporter's action, as do all amphetamine type drugs, bath salts, et cetera. And so they do it with the dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. So it's releasing serotonin as well. So there's a lot of serotonin that now the R enantiomer has to compete with, and it probably doesn't bind too frequently to the serotonin 2A receptor. That's all speculation, by the way. I don't want to act like I have evidence for that, but the serotonin 2A agonism does play a role in MDMA's effects, and people have actually shown that if you co-administer a serotonin 2A antagonist that you don't get certain effects on memory that you otherwise get with MDMA alone. So one of the things we found was that MDMA facilitated this one memory process recollection. Oh, sorry, it impaired this memory process recollection. So this would be, you know, kind of your hippocampally dependent form of episodic memory that I think most of us kind of understand. This, you know, here's me remembering yesterday that I watched that Christian Bale movie where he gets really skinny and it grossed me out and whatever. And then, you know, then you have this other form of memory, familiarity, that kind of it's almost like the kind of just recent activation or how easily information is processed in terms of the semantic or perceptual fluency. So that is, familiarity is kind of more like, I think that it's a less intuitive form of memory that, you know, we think about. But I think one example is, you know, I might see your face one day at a conference and I'm not going to remember where I met you, when I met you, what your name is, but I'm going to be like, dude, I know I've met you before. You know, that's going to be a situation in which your face is highly familiar in the absence of any recollection. And so I had this other kind of backup memory process in some ways. I think another example that I think about is when you're watching a movie that you've seen before, but maybe it's been a minute, and it's like everything feels extremely familiar, almost like deja vu, yet you can't predict what's about to happen at the very end. You know, even though there's a twist that you should remember, you can't remember that twist. And yet when the twist happens, you're just like, oh, you're not surprised by it, you know? Whereas if it had been something you actually didn't know, then you should be surprised at that twist. If it actually was deja vu where it feels familiar, but then finally the twist happens, you're like, okay, well, okay, actually I haven't seen this movie before. So that's another example of being, you know, familiar with something in the absence of any recollection. So we found that recollection was impaired, but familiarity was either spared or even enhanced. Numerically, it was enhanced. The statistics weren't perfect, but the enhancement was somewhat there with MDMA, and it was most prominent on absurdly high doses of psilocybin in which people aren't even functional, like something like 5 to 7 grams of mushrooms, which is 2 to 3 times the amount people would normally take the first time they're taking mushrooms.
What do you mean not functional? Like they're just laying there?
I mean, in this situation, they were told to get up and, you know, do, you know, to do some cognitive tasks. But I think under those doses, it's quite difficult to be able to talk and to be able to, I mean, you know, do much. And so, you know, they definitely wouldn't want to be out in public under those circumstances. And so, yeah, so people, you know, we found that if you have those drugs on board when you're first experiencing something, when you're encoding stimuli, you know, in this case, in the psilocybin study, people were shown words. In the MDMA study, they were shown pictures, and then you test their memory later. In the case of the psilocybin study, it was at the end of the day, so they're mostly sober at that point. In the case of the MDMA study, it was 2 days later, so they're definitely sober. So when you encode information under the influence of these drugs, it seems to drive one memory process while impairing the other. And that seems kind of interesting. Okay, well, you get, you know, facilitation of this, you know, familiarity process. You get, you know, facilitation of memory, of a memory process, especially at these absurdly high doses. And, you know, a lot of people want to talk about how these drugs enhance cognition. They don't mean that they enhance cognition afterwards. They mean that they're talking acutely. And yet no one's really been able to show this very well. And so here we're kind of showing this, but it's, you know, enhancing one thing and impairing something else is not always a good thing. And so, you know, one example of this that people have shown in outside of drug research, but in episodic memory research, is that under certain conditions, you can have recollection fails, but familiarity is very high. And people will get these feelings of deja vu or premonition. That is, they feel like they can predict the future, what's going to happen next. They feel like they have deja vu, even when they can't accurately predict what happens next. They can feel like they're having an insight, even though they don't actually have a real insight. So these are all situations in which, is that really a good thing? I mean, I think that we all know, you know, somebody on psychedelics who kind of sounds like that, and, you know, they just sound out there, right? And, you know, not in touch with reality. And, you know, I think that there's something similar that could be said about while people are under these drugs and they feel like they're having an insight. And, you know, sometimes it's useful to probably map the feeling of an insight onto some idea and just latch onto that idea and keep going with it because it, you know, provides your life with meaning. In other situations, I could just imagine that being extremely harmful. You know, thinking that, oh, hey, everything that I, you know, all the problems that I ever have are due to my relationship with my mom, you know? And it's like, okay, maybe that could be some of it, but like, you also have all these other issues that probably have nothing to do with, you know, the relationship with your mom. It's also like, there's a problem with you, you know? It's kind of like when people are, sometimes I feel like astrology people are like this, right? They don't want to blame their own shitty behavior, and so they blame Mercury or something. And so like I kind of I could see that going in the wrong direction. On top of that, when familiarity is high and recollection can't control it, you can sometimes also get false memories, and that's actually something we've shown in the lab without drugs. And so I mean, there are situations without psychedelics, with other sorts of drugs like dextromethorphan. This was in the 90s when all these people are these therapists are showing that people are having these recovered memories of having Satanist cults. Their family was in Satanist cults that were like abusing them, and it's like, wait a minute, there aren't even this many Satanist cults in the world. Like how are this many people having Satanist cult abusers? Like we'd have to like massively change the way we think about Satanist cults for this to be a thing. This is Elizabeth Loftus' work. And so, I mean, similarly in the lab, we can definitely, induce false memories. And I've heard from various clinicians working with patients that, I think without pinning any particular clinician, either here or at a different university, I've heard at least, I think, 3 cases of people saying that they recovered memories of abuse from their family. And based on, the just the probability of abuse, it doesn't seem like, what we already know exists in the population. And even if that's an underestimate, based on the statistics at the ends of those particular studies, it didn't seem very likely that could be a thing. And there was no hint of it even in their, when we go through these studies, when we put people through these studies, for example, and I think this is true at all universities, there's like multiple days of preparation, and there was no hint of this at all before. There was no distress from family. There was no, kind of hint at somebody being, I don't know, whatever, a sexual deviant or something. And so it just seems like it was highly unlikely. Like I here's what I'll say. I definitely believe that at least one of those 3 cases was fake, and was a false memory. And more than likely, I would say that more than one of those cases was a false memory. And so that's like, I mean, I think we do have to worry sometimes with these drugs. I mean, I do also think that they have all these benefits. I just do think we have to be a little bit cautious about how beneficial they are and how much meaning that the clinicians should attribute to the meaning that the patients are attributing to their insights.
So when you have a false memory or like a flash of insight that might not really be an insight, is that the drug like mimicking whatever really goes on in the brain when you have an insightful moment, and then it's just like, so it tricks you into feeling that?
I think so. I think that there's some degree of that. And I think I've had, much more sober, less pro psychedelic people who aren't by any means like anti-drug tell me that, oh yeah, I had all these great ideas that I thought were like the best ideas, and I couldn't ever actually grasp them and bring them into reality, I think that that's something, at least in the case of with cannabis, I've known people that say, oh yeah, I had these great ideas, and then, they wrote them down the next day, they're like, what the hell was I thinking? Like, that's disjointed. I don't know if that's the exact same, I think cannabis is definitely a different drug. But I think that in some situations they can just mimic the feeling. And I think part of it, for example, is a recollection low, familiarity high. And it's, I think that can, those 2 processes, when they dissociate like that, you can get feelings of insight, feelings of deja vu, feelings of, that you're onto something. So I think that that's, exactly it.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to ask you about is, you hear these accounts of people on psychedelics and they might see like these otherworldly beings or something like a hallucination, obviously, but then there seems to be a good amount of overlap in the case that if people talk about they saw aliens or they saw a spiritual being or they saw an angel, like whatever it is, it seems like I've wondered if they're seeing like these beings, is that because the drug is targeting like maybe a region in the brain that processes faces or something like that, and that's why they imagine they're seeing actual beings?
Right. So one thing you said is overlap. I want to go against that. I don't think there's much overlap, actually. I think I think that, for example, with salvia, man, there was no overlap. Like, one of the research systems were trying to say, oh yeah, people talk about cartoon imagery. And I was like, what about all those people that said they got realistic things, What
Uh-huh.
about all the people that had completely different cartoon imagery? What are people that didn't even have any like proper imagery that was more just like patterns that they saw? And so that's with salvia, but even with something like DMT, I mean, yeah, you tell people that they're going to see aliens, and what do you think they're going to interpret that they see? On top of that, Rick Strassman's study, they had, anal thermometers. What do you think that they got? They probably might have thought when they were tripping out on DMT that they had anal probes, right? And,
Yeah.
anal probes became directly linked to aliens via, I don't know if that South Park did that
South
first,
Park.
but I mean, that's, yeah, I want to say South Park thought about that first, but maybe it was actually, they took that idea from somebody else. But yeah, I think, I don't actually think that there's really high overlap. I think the idea that, what you said, are they potentially stimulating certain face recognition regions, for example? That makes sense. And we do, but I mean, even in studies where there's these studies that are done where there's a word for this that my cognitive neuroscience professors will kill me for not remembering, but essentially they do this reverse kind of mapping where you can show people just noise, just black and white blotches of noise. And you tell somebody that there's face in there. Every time you see a face, whenever, we flash a new image, press a button. And people will press a button. And if you average all the images in which they pressed a button, or where you get an N170, so I think that's your face response from an ERP component from, Scalp EG, you can get a kind of an archetype for a face that person has. And I don't think that everybody gets the exact same archetypes. So even in that sort of, very precise measure, do you get, and I mean, you have to do this over thousands and thousands of trials, I think, but, even in that very precise measure, I don't think people have the same archetype of what a face is. I think it's similar, 2 eyes and a mouth. But yeah, I think that, you might, that psychedelics might be hijacking the system. So one thing that people have shown, for example, is that for insight learning, that if you zap the right anterior temporal lobe, you can improve kind of, performance on tasks like the remote associates task. And so, you can imagine if, these things are, just facilitating activity there. That's also tends to be the right anterior temporal lobe is around where the face processing regions are, the fusiform face areas, right? And so you can imagine if feelings of insight are, being driven by activity there, that also perceiving faces is going to be there. But I mean, I also kind of want to, push back at least a little bit on that. And just think, I mean, look how many times people don't see faces when they close their eyes and they just get patterns and whatnot.
Mhm.
And we're also social creatures, I'm, very far from a social psychologist. So I'm not going to say this, very as well as a social psychologist would, but I mean, come on, like we see faces in everything, I can find a face in literally like anything that I try to look at and try to form 2 eyes and a mouth, maybe a
Yeah,
little
like
dot
the
for a
front of a
nose.
car.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, of course people are going to see, entities, but are they the same ones? Like, no, I don't believe that at all, unless you believe in some metaphysical universe, which that's fine if you do, but for the sake of, doing empirical work, I say keep it out of there.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to close, talking about how psychedelics should be an empirical science if they're going to be studied,
Yeah,
rather than delving into
agreed.
metaphysics.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
what someone else should do. I don't even know if I should put that on the philosophers. I don't think they want to deal with that either, but yeah.
yeah. All right, Manoj, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.